Thank you, Ursula, for this very, very kind and generous introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak, which is also really an honor. I so wish I could see some of you in for real, and especially the students, the master students, honor students. But anyway, we hope that chance will come later. So today I'll speak about domestication. And why would you want to know about that? Isn't that something to do with a historical transformation that happened many, many years ago, like thousands of years ago, maybe in the Middle East? And aren't we interested in the Anthropocene in the future? Yes, we are. And yes, it did happen a long time ago. It is called also the agricultural or the Neolithic revolution, and it is indeed ongoing. But the reason why you need to know something about domestication and multi-species relations at this very moment is, I argue, that the story about domestication is a story that has become what anthropologists call stories we live by. A kind of common knowledge about how multi-species relations unfolded back then, how states emerged, and how we came to be who we are, civilized Europeans. We could even call it a secular story of origin for the European civilization. This, what I just said, is kind of the topic of this book, Domestication Gone Wild, that I co-edited with Heather Swanson and Grovén. And some of you may have had a chance to read the introduction, which is actually freely available on the Duke webpage. And here we argue, in brief, that domestication is a story we live by, just like the Anthropocene is a story that we live by today, and that it is also closely intertwined with current challenges that we think of as the Anthropocene. But we also argue that domestication is not what you may think it is. Actually, the story we have been told about domestication is not at all up to date with recent research in archaeology or biology or anthropology. And that's not very good. In anthropology, we teach about storytelling and myths. And we know that myths are powerful. Stories are powerful. They offer models of society, models of the world as we see it, but also models for action, models for how to relate to each other and to animals. Myths and stories are often both descriptive, describing the world, and prescriptive, indicating how you should act in the world at the same time. And in anthropology, in my field, we study this, and we normally do not challenge the content of other people's myths. We're sort of neutral in those things. But when it comes to stories about the European civilization that fundamentally concern our relation as human beings to the non-human environment that includes plants and animals, birds and fish and insects, it is time that we pay attention. And when those stories are really out of sync with current research, well, then I think it's important to call out and say, wait a minute, this is worth talking about. Let's be critical, even if you are, like me, an anthropologist. So domestication is not what you probably think it is. And then what is it? That's what our book is about. And in this lecture, I'll present this common narrative of domestication. I will tell you what's wrong with it, and I'll invite you to consider some other ways of conceptualizing these relations as human beings to non-human animals and plants. I will argue that by reconceptualizing domestication, we are also going to be in a better place to address the huge and many challenges of the Anthropocene. And this is my lecture in a nutshell. But I'm going to start somewhere different. I will start at my current field site, which is also where I became an anthropologist way back in the mid-80s, and through fieldwork then. So this is a classic case of an anthropologist returns to her first field, or maybe she didn't really ever leave it. It can be discussed. So welcome to Syltefjord, which is part of the municipality of Båtsfjord, which is situated in North Norway, around here, as you see, quite far north and quite far east, about as far east as Istanbul, as far north as northern Alaska. Syltefjord is right here on the Varanger Peninsula. And here you can see a zoom on the Varanger Peninsula. And here, if you can see my arrow, I can point to you here. This is Syltefjord. This arrow now points at the cluster of houses. And now I point at the stretch of mountains that you see in the background of the picture here, okay? So then you know that the Barents Sea will be straight up north, up there somewhere, okay? So East Finnmark, Varanger Peninsula. This is now also the Arctic, technically speaking. But be aware that these labels are problematic. You can argue, I will argue, that rather than a place, the Arctic is a claim. It is a line that you can draw on maps like these, according to certain criteria that we can agree upon, such as, for example, where do we find July temperatures average lower than 10 degrees Celsius? July temperatures average lower than 10 degrees Celsius. Well, we find that here, definitely. So yeah, in that sense, it's the Arctic. There are many other criteria that people use. So that's how you can think about the Arctic. Rather than a place, we could also think about the Arctic as an affective space. You may be very excited if you are to visit to the Arctic, travel to the Arctic as a tourist. Maybe you'll see the Northern Light, and explorers have been very excited about this. So there's a strong affective component associated with the Arctic these days, very strong. There is also now a geopolitical scramble for the Arctic that I'm sure you're aware of, related to the melting ice and the new possibilities that open up both for extraction of oil, but also for transportation, global transportation by sea. So this is directly related to melting ice and the Anthropocene. But my friends who spend a lot of time right here, I don't know if I want to even say that they live in the Arctic. They live in Syltefjord, and for them, this is not remote. For them, well, they've heard about the Anthropocene, but that problem that we think about in sort of conceptually and we discuss it up and down is a problem. For them, this is a problem, very practical, posed by rivers that don't freeze as they used to, rivers that can no longer be crossed in winter, snow that comes at unexpected times, not enough, or way too much, and at the wrong time, or too frequent periods of shifting weather in winter, going all the way up to warm temperatures like above zero, so that snow melts and freezes again, so that reindeer moss and lichen gets covered by ice. And they call it låste beiter, locked pastures, and animals go hungry. This is a problem of the Anthropocene. Here in the middle of the picture is a farm, several farms in fact, but right here is a barn and right here is a yellow house. And around these farms, there's hardly any farmland. There used to be sheep here, but not anymore because the sheep farmer retired. Nobody else finds it economically viable to keep sheep here with the current agriculture policies in Norway. There's no road in the wintertime. It's only accessible by snowmobile or by boat. Doesn't mean people don't go. They go all the time by snowmobile. It's not a problem. But it's kind of hard to keep sheep these days. But many people love this place, and that includes my friend Vibeke, whom I met in the 1980s as I did fieldwork. She grew up exactly here. And now she owns this place with her husband, who's now retired. They're both retired now, and they spend a lot of time together here. So this is also a story of friendship that lasted for nearly 40 years now, and began when I was in my mid-20s. So I'll tell you a story about this place, and a very small story about this place. One evening about, oops, here's the red dot, okay. One evening about 5 years ago, maybe, Vibeke calls me on the phone. That's how we keep in touch during the most of the year. And she's very upset because they have been told by the public authorities that they can no longer cut firewood. Do you notice the trees in the foreground? These are birch trees. Birch trees grow in slopes by the river, and some break under heavy snow during winter. They always used to fetch these broken branches for firewood, but the Syltefjord River that runs through the Syltefjord Valley is running through a valley which has now been designated a nature reserve, adjacent to the Varanger Peninsula National Park that you see as a dark shade green up here. And this reserve now covers a great part of the national park covers a great part of the peninsula. The reserve is much smaller. It's not on this particular map, but it's along the valley right here. Okay. The reserve comes with signs and boundaries that are clearly marked on most maps. And they show you that the boundary of the nature reserve runs right up here, just a few meters behind me where I stand, behind the roll bound. And that's where the nature reserve starts. And if you forget it, you will very soon be reminded by these signs everywhere announcing Syltefjorddal Naturreservat or Ordo Luondomiatse in Sami. Luondomiatse means kind of landscape. Miatse means a landscape where there are many affordances where you can go to fetch various things. It's really not nature. Miatse is not nature, but it's a particular used landscape. So you can see these signs, and my goodness, it has consequences that these signs are there. Let's take a closer look. The sign lists an extract of the legal paragraphs governing this particular, regulating the use of this particular nature reserve, including this one. I'm going to read this. Vegetation, including dead bushes and trees, are protected against injury and destruction. It is prohibited to remove plants and parts of plants from the nature reserves. So parts of plants, that includes a broken branch, okay? Now Vibeke and her husband, they found the restrictions ridiculous, and her husband refused to believe that the traditional practice of fetching firewood could be harmful. So he contacted the county governor to ask for special permission to continue to do what Syltefjord people have always done. And you understand, we're talking about 10 degrees average or less in July. You do need firewood, okay? You do need firewood to keep warm. So they were told that there was no room for dispensation, not even for these people living so close by. So what is their alternative? For a while, they could either buy firewood at the local gas station in Båtsfjord, about a half an hour drive by car, where I think the firewood is imported from Lithuania or other Baltic states. Not very sustainable, I'd say. Or they could drive an hour and a half by car to Tana, south, where there is more forest and you can buy some more firewood. You can even cut it yourself. So that's the alternative. Well, we usually think of nature reserves as something good, right? I think mostly they are. Often they are. But they also perform nature in ways that are not always honoring local practices. And they are often not sensitive in relation to local and indigenous knowledge. And the irony is pretty obvious. This is her land practically. This is an area which in principle has been handed over by the Norwegian state to local and Sami ownership in what is known as Finnmarkseiendommen, or the Finnmark property. But nature reserves are regulated nationally. So for Vibeke, who comes from this place, for God knows how many centuries back or generations back, for her, this is something from elsewhere, something from the south, something some other people have invented these rules for reasons which are not always clear to her or her neighbors, or not to me either. So Vibeke and I together became very curious about this nature reserve. What is it? What is the rationale behind this reserve? So together we searched on the web, on Google, and this is what we found. And I have translated part of this text to English, and I've highlighted it in red for you. And what it says is that Syltefjord Valley Nature Reserve is protected to secure a nearly untouched deciduous forest area. Here species are found that exist at their absolute northern limit or at the very margins of their habitat. Well, you kind of got to laugh because you saw the map. What is not at its absolute northern limit if it grows here, you could ask. But apart from that, that's not what made Vibeke upset. She was more upset by these two words that I highlight, nearly untouched. What? She said. Nearly untouched? Like, what did people do in this part of the world, you know? Did they not walk here? Did they not use it? Well, of course they did. So because, for example, so we began to map this valley together, and we found many things. As it turned out, and I didn't know this, her grandmother and many others had used this valley not only to fetch firewood and as pasture for sheep, but also they had used grass meadows that they cut to feed their sheep in winter. Of course they did. Fodder. And these fields, which are kind of not really fields and not plowed, but they're just meadows of grass growing. And here you see them at a time of year when it's not very green. These are named after the users. So there was Gydeholmen after Vibekes grandmother. There was Trinestykke, there was Olastykke, and many, many other patches. Never fenced in, never inscribed on any maps, never owned in any legal way that the Norwegian state could recognize, but very, very real in local people's memory and practice. So certainly not untouched, but even so, appearing to be untouched for an untrained eye like mine, or for a visiting biologist, I suppose, trying to decide where the nature reserve boundary should be drawn. So we walk around this area and we look up and down, and then Vibeke says, and this is Moen. And I say, what is Moen? All I can see is part of a hill. I see some heather, I see a moss. It looks completely untouched to me. And she replies, this is where my father plowed. And I say, what? What? I had no idea, but it is true. And later we found this picture. This is a few years later. We have really researched this together. And she found this picture that her father took in the early 1960s. It's vast. This is Moen. It is quite adjacent to the nature reserve, about 20 meters away, maybe. And I should have known this, because if I had been more interested when I was younger, I would have noticed the old massive Ferguson tractor in the old barn, purchased in 1957 and sold in 2016, I think, on finn.no for, I think, 4,000 kroner to a collector. Or I could have noticed this, which is still there, the old plow, half covered by grass, just behind their house. I mean, it must have been there all the time. And I'm thinking, you know, you master students are going to be scholars like I am. And it's interesting to me how signs in the landscape are often there all the time, but you don't see them. You don't see them until you're somehow prepared to look for them or to see them. Sometimes you don't notice what you actually see in front of your eyes. At least I don't. And I didn't see this. I was there when I was 25. I knew the man who made all this. I knew Vibekes father who drove the tractor here. His name is Bjarne. And here he is. There he is, in his youth, posing for the photographer. Here he is. His brother is up in the doorway. And this is just before they purchased the tractor. And Vibeke was still just a little girl. And the picture is up on the living room wall. It always was. Did I notice? No. Did I ask a question? No. Well, I saw it, but I didn't see. And part of the reason, I think, is that the whole project is such a failure. Of course, that's not the whole reason. It's also my failure to see this. But when I met Bjarne, I knew him when he was around 60 and retired. Why would he volunteer to tell me about an experiment in his life with agriculture that completely ruined his health and his back and never brought him any of the sort of welfare that he was hoping for? So maybe that's not coincidental that I don't know. Nobody pointed to the plow. It was maybe a bad memory. I don't know. I asked Vibeke to explain more about what happened, and she tries to recall from her childhood when she was a girl what happened. And she tells me that he was enormously invested in the project of becoming a farmer. He wanted so much to make it, and so did the Norwegian state. So, like other small-scale farmers in Norway in the 1950s and 60s, he received subsidized loans from the state, subsidized seed, and subsidized fertilizer, and regular visits by an agriculture officer who advised them on how to go about making Syltefjord into farmland, cultivated, plowed, progressive, wonderful farmland to grow alfalfa hay for the sheep so that he could expand his sheep, because I forgot to tell you that he had sheep. And for a few years, the alfalfa grew tall, and Vibeke recalls how it was so tall that she as a child could kind of disappear underneath. But after a few years, it failed. And Vibeke shows me the topsoil as we walk across these fields today, and we can kind of, scrape the soil with the toes of our feet, of our shoes, and there's hardly any topsoil at all. There never was any topsoil here. This is what it looks like today. Okay, this is what you just saw on the other picture. So what happened to the wannabe farmers? Well, they gave up. They retired, they moved to Båtsfjord, and maybe they kept their house as a holiday home, or maybe they sold it, or maybe it still stands there falling apart. So what does this story have to do with the story of domestication? First of all, let's just say that there has been enormous political efforts to promote agriculture in Europe and elsewhere, even here at 71 degrees north, technically in the Arctic. And these dreams, these images, what you see here, are dreams about a future that never came to be. This is the future that never really could happen. It's pretty obvious, isn't it, the way I tell it now? So you got to ask why. Why did they do it? What happened here is extreme, maybe, but it is not unique. It is, I suggest, where the ideology of agriculture as the good life meets the reality of thin topsoil and very short summers, and the reality also of other marginal adaptations to landscapes that are not suited to agriculture. The reality of many, many other ways of knowing landscapes, of speaking about landscapes, of naming landscapes, not suited for agriculture. Many landscapes in the world are not suited for agriculture. I think a majority are not. But they're still livable, and they have been livable for people for years and years and years. So what are these other realities? And why did the agriculture officer fail to see them and fail to ask about them? And how can we begin to understand that even people like Bjarne, who grew up in the region, failed to honor the practices and the knowledge that had sustained his grandparents and great-grandparents for centuries? It's not so easy to answer this when the man himself is no longer with us. But at least we can say this. One specific situated answer has to do with a very strong ideology of becoming a good citizen in post-war Norway, and what that meant in terms of rethinking how this land could be livable, and what sort of landscape practices and knowledge was needed to make it livable, and also what sort of person was required to be that person who could be the farmer. Okay? I write more about this in an article, which I put up on the screen here, and you can read it, but I'm not going to go much further into it. It's an article that deals with the local unfolding of these tensions and this history, and specifically about this particular place, Syltefjord. But a very different answer, which is a complementary answer, concerns our way of thinking about multi-species relations more generally, and that is back to the story of domestication and domestication gone wild. And so let's just leave Syltefjord for now and go back to that story. In our book, we argue that domestication is also a myth. And as a myth, in a nutshell, story goes like this. And notice my quotation marks. Domestication is that significant historical moment when humans began to grow plants and to control animals for food procuring purposes. That is how the story is usually told. Okay? And if you want to hear more about how the story is usually told, I strongly recommend this film, or even just the 3-minute trailer that I have put up there. And it's called Mankind, the Story of All of Us, Breath of Farming, and you find it on YouTube. So just Google a few of these and you will find it very quickly. It's really worth looking at. And we refer to that in our introduction to the book, Domestication Gone Wild. Furthermore, what this story tells us is that the Neolithic revolution in the Middle East marks the beginning of this journey that paved the way for human population growth, for division of labor, for social stratification and state formation. And I'm sure that you kind of know this, this story. I'm sure you've heard about it, maybe even in high school. You know, you have heard this. So what am I saying here? What we're saying in this book is that the narrative of the Neolithic revolution performed the sequencing of human difference into a single evolutionary story. We also argue that domestication is a key element in this origin story of Euro-American civilization, underpinning culture and nature, civilized and savage, us and them, here and now, then and now. That's a big argument, and I cannot go through all its different elements. But let me just say this. What I'm saying here is that a historical account, which is presented to you as factual, as accurate, this account is creating a particular understanding of human relations with non-human animals and with each other. And this account underpins a number of ideas that are wrong, that are in part old racialized evolutionary baggage, outdated understandings of archaeology, but also mixed in with facts that are also correct, and rhetorical strategies that are evocative. If you don't believe me, watch the trailer. Music, images, everything. And this makes it all the more powerful, and you need to be quite critical of such stories, like many good stories, because they're not either 100% right or 100% wrong, but both. And that's part of the problem. Now, let's go through some ways in which this story, as it is commonly told, is wrong. And this is reiterating what archaeologists are teaching their students already, and have been for a long time, but what common non-archaeologists don't really know, most of them, unless they're particularly interested. So domestication is actually, these are corrections, quotation marks, kind of. Domestication is a gradual process. It was not a revolution at all. It took many, many, many years. We're talking about hundreds of years, many generations before these changes happened, before these new adaptations took hold, okay? So it was not a revolution. It was a reversible process. It seems to us, from this perspective of living in Europe today, that it's a one-way street. It's unilinear. It's one direction. But in fact, domestication has happened many places, or we can rather say cultivation of land with agricultural techniques has happened in a number of places in the world and been reversed. The most interesting example, I think, is the Amazon, where actually cultivation happened and then they returned. And it's now, rainforest. So it can be reversed. It can also not be reversed, because you can ruin the landscape in such a way that it cannot be reversed, but that's a different thing. It can be reversible. There are multiple processes, as I just said, occurring many places in the world, not only in the Middle East. And furthermore, quite importantly, it's a mutual process. We're talking about co-evolution, and we're talking about a situation in which agency, the capacity to act and make a difference, is distributed, in the sense that it is distributed or shared among humans and non-human species like animals and plants. Furthermore, I'm not saying that people didn't have intentions, because clearly they did. And sometimes changes happened as a result of those intentions, but quite often changes happened as a result of not their intentions. They were like unexpected changes, and unintentional transformations took place. Archaeologists don't know, how many of these changes that we can see in domesticated animals are actually a result of intentional changes and how many are not. If you know anything at all about dog breeding, you will know that many unintended consequences follow from breeding. But some suggest that most changes are actually unintentional. Very few are a result of human intentions. That's probably debated. It's a multi-species relationship. It doesn't do to just think about this as a relation between me and my goat right here in the picture. It's a relation between me, my goat, and all the other hosts of insects, parasites, microbiomes, pieces of straw on the ground, the soil, what happens in the soil, the topography, the weather, the predators of the goats. I mean, there's no end. So that's some of the ways in which domestication is told in the wrong way. Now, the problem is not only that the narrative is wrong, but also, and we argue in our book, what the narrative does. These are two different things. So let's turn more to what the narrative does. What kind of images of the world, models of society, models for action, does this narrative cement or uphold or maintain? Okay. Let's look at 3 unexamined paradigms of the domestication story. The first one is about human agency, and it claims, it cements, it maintains an idea of anthropocentrism, placing humans at the center and arguing indirectly or directly that human agency is a driver of evolutionary change, which I have just said, probably not. And along with this is an emphasis on human control and animal confinement. Control and confinement are key terms here, because when we read about domestication and we look at definitions of domestication across a number of disciplines, we find often that control and confinement are key criteria in these conventional definitions of domestication. So when we study ways, when we as anthropologists today study ways in which people relate to animals and plants, where in places where agriculture was never a very good option, like in the Arctic, for example, we often find that control and confinement are not really very good as descriptive terms. Think about reindeer, for example. They are companion species for Sami in Finnmark, for some Sami. They are legally owned, but they're really not controlled. They're certainly not confined. Rather, mutuality is a much better approach to understand the relation between them and the caretakers. And furthermore, the relation between reindeer and their human caretakers cannot be seen as a bilateral relation between human and animal, but rather as a multi-species relation that includes particular affordances and topographies of the vast landscape that the Sami would call Miatsi, and that includes lichen, mushrooms, snow, and now also ice in the Anthropocene. So, yeah, just an example. Second point, it's a linear progress. The Neolithic Revolution describes steps towards human civilization. If you look at this film clip I showed you earlier, you will see what I mean. Come on, what's going on here? Are Sami people less civilized? Are Inuits less civilized because they never used agriculture the way we do in Europe? Are nomadic people less civilized? Are Australian Aborigines less civilized? I mean, it's obvious. We don't even want to go there. We don't even want to think this way. And unfortunately, that is exactly what the story of agricultural revolution and domestication has allowed people to argue. Maybe not always directly, but indirectly and rhetorically, through the way it's been told as the only road that people need to follow. And some years ago, that was much more explicit, but it still is with us. It's haunting our understanding of multi-species relations and human relations to animals and plants, I argue. It's haunting, it's still with us. And thirdly, universalism. That's related to the previous point, making this story universal, or just because certain things happened in the Middle East and spread to much of Europe, mid-Europe, Northern Europe, and that's true, it doesn't mean that that's a standard story for the whole world. The Neolithic story of cultivation in the Middle East is not a universal marker of human civilization, although it is often claimed to be. So the narrative, because it is often thought about this way, the story of domestication then, as civilization, underpins and justifies state policies in Europe and elsewhere of agricultural settlement, ownership, control, confinement, as the unrivaled mode of engaging with natural surroundings, the most productive and prosperous mode of engaging with natural surroundings, what we should all do and get better at, even at northern latitudes, such as in Finnmark. And because this story justifies pitting agriculture against vernacular or Sami landscape practices in Finnmark, for example, as a sign of progress. It orders people along the same scale as more or less civilized, based on whether or not some shifting ideals of agriculture are actually being performed or not. And I think what I've told you about Finnmark here can be applied to other parts of the world. I know it can be applied to parts of India. I know it could be applied other places as well, but other people may know more about this for sure. So just a final image here about sorting people and sorting land. These images are from the Pasvik Valley in Finnmark in the 1930s. They're still Varanger, but we're talking now about South Varanger. And they are from what is called bureising, which is essentially also what Bjarne was doing in Syltefjord. Bureising means to cultivate new land. And here you see images of Sami people to the left and Norwegians to the right. They made the distinction very clearly at the time. And the first category was seen at the time as definitely backwards. I mean, these people here, lagging behind in cultural evolution. Nothing less. This was the 1930s. And the second category was associated with progress and the good life and what we should all become. How should we locate this guy in relation to these two? This image is 20 years younger. It's late 1950s, maybe 30 years afterwards. Perhaps we should rather ask, how did Bjarne situate himself? Who did he aspire to be? It's hard for me to say exactly because we had never talked about this. But the photo, I think, gives it away. And I wonder, what choice did he have? We will shift gear now completely and go back to this. I've told you what domestication is according to a common myth. And then drawing on archaeology, I've told you what it is not and how it differs from the common myth. So now let us turn to the question, what is domestication? How can we approach this phenomenon, which has so radically transformed landscapes and seascapes, co-producing the condition we now know as the Anthropocene? To answer this question, we can turn many ways. We can turn to many different places. We can go up north and ask what Arctic survival entails when the plow and the fertilizer is not part of the equation. We could go also to the Sahel, to the nomads of the Sahel in Africa. We could go to the Mongolian nomads, and we could describe a number of ways in which people have made a living for themselves through other means than conventional agriculture. And that's what we do in the rest of this book, Domestication Gone Wild, with chapters on different ethnographic examples, including from North Norway, but also Mongolia, South Africa, New Guinea, and many other places. And what we often find through these chapters is that human control, ownership, and confinement are not as central as a number of definitions of domestication claim. But we can also turn to the belly of the beast, the large-scale cases of industrial agriculture and industrial aquaculture. And I'll need some water. So, like Alex Blanchette has done here in this book, Porkopolis, when he visited US industrial pork production facilities, or as I did when I did fieldwork with John Law, Professor of Science Studies at Norwegian salmon farms in West Norway. Both are sites of intensive food production, agriculture and aquaculture. Alex Blanchette describes a region in the Midwest where hogs, that's pork, that's pigs, outnumber humans by more than 50 to 1. And I thought, how does that work out in our site? And our ethnographic site is the coastal village in Hardanger, similarly dependent on salmon aquaculture as this region in the Midwest. And here I think that salmon would outnumber humans by, I would say, 10,000 to 1, maybe. That's a rough guesstimate. It doesn't really matter. But if I had a choice, I would much rather work on this salmon farm to the left after having read Alex Blanchette's book. But the workers that Alex Blanchett meets, they do not have much of a choice. They are migrant laborers from Central America who take what they can get. They are also workers whose workplace is so tightly managed by biosecurity measures that they are confined to interact only with people who are part of their own workstation, so to speak, because as living human beings, they are potentially vectors of infectious pork disease, such as the porcine epidemic diarrhea virus that knocked out the industry in 2013. So the domestication, the domus here, reaches far beyond the confines of the pig farm. As such, it reaches across entire landscapes in the Midwest. Entire landscapes are affected in so many ways, and he describes this in the book. And workers' lives are deeply intertwined with those of industrially produced pork, which is a very profit-intensive production, vertically integrated scheme. And so is aquaculture. Fortunately for the people to the left here, well, you don't see any people in the picture, but they will be working on these platforms. Viruses are much less likely to travel between fish and humans than between pigs and humans. So the conditions are a little different. And here too, the boundaries of the domus are far from firm. If you look up close, it looks like a house in the middle of the fjord. That's where I took the picture that you saw previously. And if you come up close, you'll see things like this: rails, netting, several layers of netting on top and below, and then pipes and walkways, a complex machinery that tries to hold salmon in place, or as Jean puts it in an article, it tries to separate nature outside the pen from culture or cultivated salmon inside the pen. The human attempts at ordering, confining, and keeping separate are many, and they seem at first sight to confirm the definition of domestication as confinement and control, but appearances betray. The fact is that the netting tells us very little about what goes on down under, below the water surface. That is where aquaculture takes place, underwater. And it matters in a number of ways. For example, it means that sea lice are part of the aquaculture domus assemblage. Sea lice, also called salmon lice. Sea lice naturally occur in waterways where salmon migrate, but a densely populated salmon cage gives them a fantastic opportunity to multiply on salmon. And this is a huge challenge, and it has been for years. It's a huge challenge for farm salmon welfare, but much more so for the wild salmon smolt to pass these pens by just a few hundred meters on their way to the Atlantic. And because in Norway, the regulations try to protect the wild salmon, not always successfully, but there is a strong attempt. For this reason, there are so many attempts to get rid of the sea lice that really compromise salmon welfare and also are quite costly. So let's look at this. Here's the problem to the left. And here's the solution to the right, or one of them, or so they thought back in 2012. This is a wrasse. It's also known as cleanerfish or rensefisk in Norwegian. And it was just one among many remedies to sort of alleviate the problem of sea lice. They had been using medication of many, many sorts, and after a while the sea lice got sort of adapted or immune to this, resistant to this medication, and they have turned to so many other techniques also: warm water baths, fresh water baths, high pressure showers. I mean, there's no end. Well, it's not endless, but there are many, many solutions. This is just one of them. But overfishing, so wrasse exists in Norwegian fjords, lots of them. But so they were fished and they were dumped into the pens together with the salmon and the sea lice in order to nibble on the sea lice, because you see, wrasse loves to eat sea lice. So they go up to the salmon and eat it. Nice. First I thought, oh, what a great organic solution to this. And in a way it is. But the problem is you need a lot of wrasse. So because there's so much salmon farming in Norway, you need a lot of wrasse, and overfishing occurred. And overfishing and spreading wrasse all over Norway, throwing them into pens in fjords where they did not belong. Of course, it was bad for the wrasse welfare, compromised terribly the wrasse welfare, but also for the wild wrasse stock in the fjords. naturally occurring in Norwegian fjords. So for this reason, they began wrasse domestication, but that also is difficult. So welcome to the Anthropocene. This is what I write about in the chapter called Unruly Appetites. And the problem here, I argue, is not domestication as such. Human beings have been part of animals' lives for as long as we inhabited this planet. We have co-evolved in a number of ways. Some of these are quite all right. Dogs, horses, reindeer, but there are good ways and not so good ways of keeping dogs, horses, reindeer, salmon, hogs, whatever. The problem we see here, I argue, is not that it is underwater. It is not that salmon cannot live a reasonably good life as domesticated species, or at least as good as many other husbandry animals that we like to eat. It is primarily a question of scale. Because as Alex Blanchette shows, and as those who work with salmon aquaculture know, scale and density create the conditions for a perfect storm. The first attempts at domesticating terrestrial animals created zoonoses that made people ill. This is well known. And James Scott calls it the late Neolithic multi-species resettlement camp when he refers to this early domestication in the Middle East, where novel experiments took place. As a result, some groups of human beings, some human beings, including Europeans, built up immunity to what we now know as common viral diseases like influenza. Salmon farming has similar problems, but the problems are underwater and mostly out of sight. And the problem of sea lice is one of them. And I think that what we might say then is that the early Anthropocene multi-species resettlement camp is another word for what we see here. Okay, it's time to wrap up. How can we define domestication in a way that does not assume control, confinement, or place humans as a single agential force? And how can we approach domestication in a way that does not situate it from the outset as either good or bad? Here is one suggestion, one way in which we could approach domestication. I'm not going to read this. You don't need to cite it, but it's just a different way of talking about domestication than control. Sorry about this. That's what you happen when you forget to turn off your sound. Now, good. So that's one suggestion. But rather than searching for definitions, I think we are better off asking ourselves, how can we best get on with living together across species barriers in a world that is already intertwined, messy and frail, and where there is no clear boundary between nature and culture, and there never was? I think that places like Finnmark can help us answer this, help us find an answer, but only as long as we acknowledge that nature and culture were always two sides of the coin, never completely separate. It means to recognize that people like Vibeke and you and me are part of complex webs of relations that cannot simply be protected by upholding a notion of separation with a fictional idea that nature conservation performs as nearly untouched. It means to recognize also that even within relations that appear to be based on confinement and control, appearances deceive, and control is sometimes no more than a faint ideal which cannot be realized in practice. And if you wonder about that, read Alex Blanchette. It means that we need to be careful, less arrogant when trying to fix things like sea lice, or when trying to produce things like pigs or salmon. Such species are nearly always less controllable than we think, and also more sentient and worthy of our attention and care. And this calls for curiosity across species barriers, towards species that we think of as wild, but also towards those species that are in some form of human confinement. And that's where I need to end. So thank you.